Hello, good morning, welcome. We thank you for your presence. We thank God for all that He is and all that He does. And we're grateful to be together as we praise Him this morning. What a way to begin our week in that worship. We're going to be in 1 Kings, Old Testament book of 1 Kings. We'll be in 1 Kings chapter 17. If you want to be turning to that chapter, 1 Kings chapter 17. It's a true principle that we save what we value. We value what we save. It works hand in hand together. We maybe initially think about saving in terms of money and finances. And there was a young man who thought he had the right idea. He was coming home and he walked in the front door and he was panting and out of breath, sweaty. And his dad says, "What's the matter?" And he said, "Well, I just saved $2.50. And the dad said, well, okay, how'd you save $2.50? And he said, "I decided to run home instead of taking the bus home." So the dad looked at him and thought, well, what's this kid thinking? And he said, "Son, think about what you just said." He said, "Well, how about you replay this event in the future? And how about you save $20 by chasing the taxi home instead of the bus?" Maybe the idea of saving, but misunderstanding what it means to actually save. True story about American Airlines. They had a CEO who was highly on top of the money and the finances and cost cutting. He was very effective at it. And so he did some studies over the course of time, every direction he could think of. So they looked at the leftovers from their first class customers. And what he figured out is we can lose some of those olives from the first class salad that's served on every flight. And they dropped the number of olives per salad from 4 down to 3. And it's estimated that they saved at least $40,000 that year. 1980s is when that happened. So literally, they cut 1 olive per salad and saved $40,000. He valued money. He valued their company's profitability. And notice that he saved 1. He started with just 1 olive per plate, and it compounded into tremendous savings. As we think about the mission of God, when we think about this word save, we have to keep remembering that God has always shown us that He values 1, and that He values us one by one, and He values the world one by one. And even those that we might struggle to value, those that we might ordinarily look over, we see time and time again that He values them one by one. In the scripture reading that Will read for us this morning, Matthew chapter 18, it's exactly the point Jesus is making. In the context of these little ones, these children, He says, "What do you think if a man has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray?" And here's the shocking part. Does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? As shocking as that is, it's shocking when we're not shepherds. For a true shepherd, one who has the heart of a shepherd, it makes perfect sense. Every single one matters. So I will go to great lengths to reach that one and to show my love and compassion to that one. So verse 13, "If he finds it, truly I say to you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it's not the will of my Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish." God does not rejoice when we perish. God rejoices when we find Him, when we know Him, when we begin to experience the peace and the love He offers. He tells us that everyone matters. And thus we see that each one matters. Because we can know that every single person who's ever lived or will live matters to God, time and time again we see on the individual level that one matters. And so our aim this morning and the next Sunday morning is just to key in on this key principle. That since each one of us, each one outside of these walls, matters supremely to God, each one must matter to us just the same. The Jews had a hard time with that principle. They were pretty convinced, hey, God loves us more. And because the leaders were leading the Israelites or the Jews and teaching them and knew the law, some of them thought, well, he loves us even more than he loves the average Jew because we're the ones teaching. One of those incidents happens in his hometown in Luke chapter 4. When he gets up and he reads from the prophet Isaiah chapter 61, and he says, today this has been fulfilled in your hearing. And they don't like that Jesus is preaching this good news. They don't like that he's taking up for the people they don't ordinarily take up for. And so that's when he says that a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. And he uses two illustrations, two examples from the Old Testament. The northern kingdom Israel, the people that went further away from God faster and first. And he says, you know, there were plenty of people suffering in Israel in those times, but it was a foreigner who received the blessing of God. One soul found the favor and attention of God despite there being a lot of people in Israel who suffered. He intentionally wanted them to wrestle with that truth, that God saw and cared to the level of one. So that's our aim this morning as we turn our attention to 1 Kings chapter 17. And so Jesus is going to point us to this widow of Zarephath. You see the spelling on the screen, Z-A-R-E, Zarephath. And he does so to say this: God's always been this way. They were surprised and shocked that Jesus would care so much about the people who were hardest to care for, and yet Jesus wants them to see, no, this is the heart and the character of God, and he has always cared for one, down to the one single person. All right, 1 Kings chapter 17. What's going to happen here is you'll see verse number 1 of that chapter. We're introduced to Elijah. Elijah the Tishbite of Gilead said to Ahab, Ahab's the king of northern kingdom Israel, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, so the Lord lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Now, there's a lot to unpack that we don't have all of the details in this very verse, but you've got this battle between Baal, the god that Jezebel, the king's wife, served. Baal was this dominant god of this region, the Canaanites. And you've got Elijah constantly speaking up for God, for Yahweh. He is the one who keeps Yahweh's name out in the open. The other prophets are giving in, and they're trying to make room for both Baal and God. But Elijah is the clear, constant voice that says, no, Baal cannot be allowed to continue in terms of this attention. He's not real. He doesn't live. That's the back and the forth that's going to happen. It's going to come to a climax in chapter 18, of course, with that incident with the 400 prophets, the fire on Mount Carmel. That's the third in 3 miracles that happens. We're going to look at the first 2 in chapter 17. But you need to see this conflict between Baal and Elijah stepping up for the truth about God. Now, here's what's interesting about Baal. His primary region of influence, at least that he was contributed or assigned to, if you will, by the Canaanites, was that he was the god of weather, and especially storms and rain. And so when it rained and it poured and their crops were nourished, they thought they were in good standing with Baal. So that gives a lot of light to what's about to happen. There's a drought. We're told that's going to last 3.5 years. You think about that Mount Carmel incident where fire comes and there's no rain and all of this. Well, Baal is that god that they think is responsible for this. Now, that poses an interesting question in the yearly rhythms of a desert people. What do they think and what do they argue when it's dry season and their chief god is the god of rain? One of the theories they tried to promote was the idea that, well, another god comes through and he temporarily kills Baal, and then another god has to come through and kill that god, and he'll release Baal. And so what they ended up doing was tying life and death into this cycle of the weather. And so you're going to see those themes constant in these next few chapters. Not only weather with the rain and the drought, but ultimately life and death. That since the true God is the God of all the world and creation, and the God of weather, of rain and storms, he also has greater power to the level of people. He can speak life. He can speak life from death. So this drought is the background to that, but it's going to be the explanation for a lot of things that keep happening too. All right, so he promotes this drought, and now he's got to run. Well, Elijah runs. He gets fed by God. He gets nourished with water from a creek. He gets fed by ravens. Ravens were unclean animals. There's something God's trying to tell Elijah there. Got to look for things from unexpected places. You're my servant. But he's sending him ravens to feed him. Well, eventually the ravens stop bringing him food and the brook dries up. So now look at verse number 8. The word of the Lord came to him, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath. So he's dependent upon God. He's trusting him. He's all alone with this creek and the ravens. But then as the drought continues and the drought's effects keep on moving downstream, God sends him on to someone else. Now, we don't know Zarephath from anywhere. Like, it's just a name, right? But it's in the place called Phoenicia, which is the hometown of Jezebel. Zarephath is the home area of Jezebel, the one who married King Ahab. So he's going into the heart of the place where Baal worship started. One author even said it's kind of like the Baal Belt. We call the South the Bible Belt. Well, he's going into the heart of the Baal Belt of that region of the world. But he doesn't go to the palace. He doesn't go to an altar. He goes and he is supposed to find a widow. And the language is fascinating that we read there in verse number 9. God says, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he's going to see one, but notice it's not just the widow that he sees. It's not just the widow's son. It's not just these outsiders. It's also Elijah. He's taking care of Elijah, his prophet, his mouthpiece, who's speaking up for him and communicating this word. Now, here's what we probably need to see at this stage. That we're going to find each one. It means that we're going to have to go to and be in some unexpected places and even some uncomfortable places. Here we're going to see how much God loves each one. And we don't understand that meaning if we just assume that Zarephath is another city just like the rest. Or if we assume that it's a Jewish city. It's not. It's a pagan city. It's covered over with Baal worship. This lady was not a believer in God before Elijah ended up there. But because he was willing to go to a place that would have been uncomfortable, he is able to see, and now we're able to see, and then Jesus, centuries later, is able to tell the Jews, look how much God cares for each single one. Each single person. Let's now read beginning of verse number 10. He arose, went to Zarephath. When he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and said, bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her, said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. While you're getting me water, I could use some bread. She said, as the Lord your God lives. She's heard his message already. So as the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, nothing prepared, sitting on the counter, and only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son that we may eat it and die. You hear the heartbreaking nature of her statement? It means her son is probably too young to be able to help. Her husband has passed. She's a widow. And also think through this part of the story as it unfolds. Who else is there around her to help? There ought to have been other people there around her to help, and yet there are none. There were no laws of Baal that provided for how widows ought to be taken care of. God spoke laws on how the children of Israel were to take care of their widows. So in theory, if this were happening in Israel or in Judah, it should have been addressed by people keeping the law. Well, here you have lawless people, pagan people, and they're not taking care of this widow who has virtually nothing left, so much so that she's going to build one last fire to bake one last bit of bread that will sustain them until they then starve to death. That's happening because it's, again, downstream from the drought. Elijah speaks the drought. God miraculously causes the drought to happen. And downstream from it, people are suffering. Ultimately because of their allegiance to Baal. Because Ahab thinks somehow he can make room for both Baal and God. Jezebel's desire is far different. She's not content with both. She's demanding full allegiance to Baal. Well, now you see, in this small little house in the middle of Zarephath, a widow is preparing to die, and knowing her son will die also, until Elijah steps in. He tells her, if you'll prepare me the cake first, then you'll be able to eat constantly through the end of the drought. You'll never run out. So that's shades of Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom and his righteousness. God will continually give these things to you. She serves the messenger of the Lord first, and God blesses her miraculously throughout the end of the drought. She never runs out of food. So we see first that this miracle happens, that he's able to give her the food she needed. He is able then to eat the food he needed. So you see God taking care of Elijah, and you see God taking care of this family through Elijah, because he was willing to go to one who was in need, who was in desperate need, no matter where she was located. But then the story takes an unexpected turn. It was unexpected because both the widow and Elijah say so. Look at verse number 18. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, that meaning her being the lord of the house, or the lordess of the house, meaning she's the one responsible, became ill. The son became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, "What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son." She both simultaneously has a greater awareness of God and his holiness and righteousness, but also a misunderstanding of how God operates. She thinks that because this holy messenger of God is in her presence, that must mean God has finally found out about her sin. And now he's making her pay by killing her son. It's healthy. It's even righteous that she is aware of her sin and how that offends God. But it's a blatant misunderstanding to think that God would send down and cause her son to suffer and kill him just because she had sinned. Well, it catches her off guard. She does not expect it, and now her son is dead. And think of how cruel this is. This is where Elijah is going to come in. If somehow God had caused it, why would he have spared the son by feeding him to then turn around and kill him? It's not how God operates. But of course, we all wrestle with emotions and questions like hers. We might wrongly think that God reaches down and takes and kills and harms. And yet in a world that's full of sin, that's been marred by sin, death happens. Suffering happens. Sickness happens. And it just so happens that in this situation, he dies. So look at verse 20. Here's what Elijah does. He cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourn by killing her son?" Elijah is wrestling with some of the same questions that she wrestled with. He says, "I'm your messenger, and I'm still not really following why and how this happened." So verse 21, then he stretched himself upon the child. He touched him 3 times, cried to the Lord, "O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again." And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, "See, your son lives." What a great wrapping up of this story, or at least to this point. See, your son lives. She was thrown over in grief. Elijah was confused by this. And yet because he depended upon the Lord, just as he had to eat and to drink prior, now he cries out and he asks God, I know you're the God over weather. You must also be the God over life and death. And because you've put me up here, you've sent this widow to feed me, and you've sent me to take care of her, I'm begging you to bring her back to life, or bring him back to life from his death. So see, your son lives. What a powerful moment. Foreshadowing, of course, the power of resurrection, but specifically even Jesus' own resurrection. Now you begin to see even more reasons why Jesus would want the Jews to be familiar with this very story. Jesus is a greater Elijah who feeds us and gives us life beyond the grave, life beyond death. And just through verse number 23 that we read, we get this promise. We see this coming to the surface, that God cares for each one who's in the shadow of death. Elijah himself was in the shadow of death. His brook had dried up. His food was gone from the ravens. But God sent him to the widow. He commanded the widow to feed him. He cared for Elijah when Elijah, this mighty messenger of God, was in each one. And he also cared for this helpless widow and her son through the work of Elijah. And then he cared for the son when he had died. They all three are face to face with death. And God intervenes, not on this grand scale where he gets all sorts of public credit, like what's going to happen in chapter 18, but just in one single house, in a very pagan, wicked area, head to head with Baal, with Jezebel, to say, these people care. Again, to hear that a woman is preparing her last meal for her and her son, we should rightly have some discomfort with that and questioning, why isn't anyone going to help her? Why aren't the residents of this area going to help her? Why aren't the prophets of Baal going to help her? And yet, because of their wickedness and how they had turned against God, they didn't have the capacity for that compassion necessary to care for her and to help her. So if we're going to find some overlap, we need to see ourselves having that same level of despair and asking, who's going to help widows today? Who's going to help modern-day widows of Zarephath? And the question ought to be answered resoundingly with those who know God, because God sees them and God cares for them. Those who know God likewise ought to care for them just the same. Psalm 68, verse 5. He's the father of the fatherless. The protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. God settles the solitary in a home. The New Living Translation words that opening line of verse 6 this way: God places the lonely in families. Those who are suffering because they're alone, he gives them people. Well, that's the process you see happening here. Again, it's leading into the grand stage of chapter 18, but it's a singular, each one by one moment where God shows himself to care and now motivates us to care to the same level he does. You can see a clear connection over to James chapter 1, verse 27, that pure religion, that's undefiled religion before God the Father, is this: to visit or to care for widows and orphans in their affliction, to recognize they are helpless because of their station in life. And then whatever is required to walk with them, to sit with them, to love them, to hear them, God does. And he now compels us to do the same, to see them as one and to treat them as one. So what you see happening is, for God to show us that every single one matters, he goes to the heart of a place that's dead set against him. They don't recognize him. They worship this false god. They're involved in all sorts of immorality because of that paganism. And he cares for what might have been the most vulnerable household in the entire land. If Baal was real, which of course he's not, this widow has escaped his view. Her son has escaped his view because here he lies dead. But God acts through Elijah, and God brings them food, and God brings him life and sustains them. What an opportunity he gives us as his people to care for those who are least among us. But notice verse 24. You see this really come to life when you see her response. The woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." She said that which Ahab and all these other prophets who claim to be prophets of God too, she said what they were unwilling to say. They would not stand up for God in fullness and in truth, and yet this vulnerable, close-to-death widow does utter praise toward God. "Oh, Elijah, I see that you're truly from God, and I see that what God has spoken through you is actually true. That all I've heard about Baal and everybody else is not. But what you say, because it comes from God, is true." So God cares for one to the level of each one, so much so that she now believes in God. I think that's also in view with Jesus when he mentions her in Luke chapter 4, that he wants them to see that not only did God care for this foreigner to the level of each one, but also that she was able to listen and observe honestly to the point of being brought to faith. They were stubborn and hard-hearted to the point that they could not believe in Jesus. And yet she, looking at all of her background, you would say, well, she's not a believer. She can't believe. There's no hope for her. And yet she's the light in the midst of darkness during this dark period time in Israel. It is interesting that they were largely successful economically and militarily under the reign of Ahab. But oh, did they miss it and spiral out of control religiously before God because they allowed Jezebel to wrongly influence them. And he thought he could kind of make both sides happy. So as we wind down thinking through this principle, we're mindful of how many opportunities God gives us to speak, to listen, to act on his behalf, to be that light that shines in the midst of darkness. And it begins with each one. It begins with each one of us, recognizing the value in each one who's out in the world around us. When Jesus would read that passage in Luke chapter 4 from Isaiah 61, he was to proclaim good news to the poor. He was to proclaim liberty to the captives, to set at liberty those who were oppressed. You see that happening in the life of Elijah before him. And now we see that even greater degree happening in Jesus' ministry and then gospel to set us free ultimately from sin. And so when you see the church beginning, the church living out the gospel in the book of Acts, after chapter 2, the first thing they do is heal a lame man in Acts chapter 3. Keep on continuing. They feed the widows in Acts chapter 6. They raise Aeneas and Tabitha, Acts chapter 9. They rescue the slave girl in Philippi in Acts chapter 16. They have an eye that sees one by one those who are most vulnerable. And they know God cares about everyone, so they're going to reach each and every one. We look at her helplessness, and we wonder who's going to help her, who's going to say something, who's going to do something. And likewise, so many around us are in similar situations. And we might be the only ones with opportunities to say something that could then introduce them to God. I can bring you some groceries. I can come sit with you all afternoon. I can take you to your appointment. You can stay here with us. You don't have to face this alone. Each one can hear those things from us when we treat them and view them as God does. You're in a hospital very often, you know everybody's ears perk up and the mood changes instantly no matter where you're at, no matter why you're there, when you hear the two words, code blue. For the most part, procedure is they call out a code blue. And anybody who's got free hands is supposed to come help with that one who's near to death or is in the process of dying. It's a fascinating sight to see the energy shift. Not only people concerned, but the people who can do something about it moving into place to do something about it. I'm guessing that for an audience this size, you've been in a hospital where that's been said, and I'm guessing there's several who've been in a hospital when that's said about your loved one. I've been on a visit or two where it's been said over the loudspeaker, and we're there visiting this family, and It's awe-inspiring, even though you're sad and concerned about what's happening. Think about what would happen if you had been in the hospital for a few days or a few weeks. And as your loved ones are telling you what all's transpired, they tell you you coded a few times while you were out and while you're under. Imagine the difference in being wheeled out of the hospital having heard that news about your own stay. You're seeing these doctors, these nurses, and you're sitting there wondering, did they come help me when I was close to death? Or were they running to come help? Were they holding the paddles? Were they administering aid that only they could render? You're alive. You're saved leaving that hospital because they saw you not as a patient, not as a number, not as a dollar figure, but as one worth saving. Likewise, God has seen us as the one out of the 99 who was worth saving, that Jesus came to save, and that the church is in a position to reach out to and extend that salvation to you and to us. And so as we each challenge ourselves to see others more on a one-by-one basis, we start with knowing, I've been the one. I am the one that He came to save and to rescue. And therefore I cannot help but remember that each one I now see is deserving of that same opportunity to obey Christ. This morning, you recognize your need to respond to that offer of salvation. Don't put it off any longer. Choose today and choose now to put Him on in baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. Perhaps you are the sheep who's wandered off. You know the joy of salvation as a Christian, but you also have allowed sin to overtake you. You don't have to stay away. He has come to save you. He will celebrate you once again. Please know that we're here to help in any way with anything you might face. Would you come now as we sing?